The way you start your morning silently decides the direction of your entire life. Most people never realize this because they wake up already tired, already distracted, and already losing control of their day before the sun even rises. 3 years ago, Ethan Carter was one of those people. He was 22 years old, living alone in a tiny apartment on the edge of Chicago, surviving on cheap takeout meals, unfinished dreams, and excuses he repeated to himself every single night. His room was always dark. Dirty clothes covered the floor. Empty coffee cups sat on his desk beside a glowing phone screen that kept him awake until 2 or 3 in the morning. Every night, Ethan promised himself the same thing. Tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow I'll wake up early. Tomorrow I'll fix my life. But tomorrow never came. Every morning his alarm rang at 6 o'clock, and every morning his hand reached out from under the blanket just to hit snooze again. 10 minutes became 30. 30 became an hour. Soon sunlight filled the room while Ethan remained asleep, missing opportunities he once swore he would chase. At first, he blamed bad luck. Then he blamed stress. Then he blamed the economy, his childhood, and even other people. But deep down, Ethan knew the truth. His biggest enemy was the person staring back at him in the mirror every morning. One cold Tuesday morning, Ethan woke up at 11:47 a.m. to the sound of his phone vibrating across the table. He grabbed it quickly, his heart pounding as he saw 3 missed calls from a company he had interviewed with the week before. His stomach tightened. He listened to the voicemail with shaking hands. "Hi, Ethan. We waited for you this morning, but since you never arrived, we had to move forward with another candidate. We wish you the best." Ethan sat frozen on the edge of his bed. He had completely forgotten about the second interview. Slowly, he looked around his apartment. The curtains were closed. The air felt heavy. A half-eaten burger rested beside unpaid bills on the kitchen counter. For the first time in a long time, Ethan stopped making excuses. He whispered quietly to himself, "What am I doing with my life?" That question stayed in his mind the entire day. While scrolling through social media later that night, Ethan watched old classmates celebrating promotions, business launches, engagements, and vacations. Everyone seemed to be moving forward while he remained trapped in the exact same place. The more he watched, the heavier his chest felt. Around 2:30 in the morning, unable to sleep, Ethan threw on a gray hoodie and walked outside into the freezing streets. The city felt strangely silent. Streetlights reflected off wet sidewalks while cold wind rushed through the empty roads. Ethan shoved his hands into his pockets and kept walking with no destination in mind. Then suddenly, in the distance, he noticed someone running toward him. An older man wearing a black hoodie jogged calmly through the quiet street, as if the freezing weather meant nothing to him. The strange thing was not the man himself. The strange thing was the time. Ethan pulled out his phone and checked the screen. 4:58 a.m. The old man slowed down as he approached Ethan, then stopped directly in front of him. His breathing remained calm. His eyes looked focused and alive in a way Ethan had not felt in years. Then the man smiled slightly and said something Ethan would never forget. Most people never meet the best version of themselves because they are asleep when discipline arrives. Ethan stared at the old man for several seconds without saying a word. The freezing wind moved through the empty street, while distant traffic echoed somewhere far away in the city. For some reason, those words hit him harder than anything he had heard in years. The old man looked ordinary. Gray hair, calm face, worn running shoes. Yet there was something different about the way he carried himself. He looked peaceful, focused, alive. Ethan finally let out a small nervous laugh and shook his head. "Easy for you to say," he replied quietly. "Some people just are not built for discipline." The old man smiled gently, almost as if he had heard those exact words many times before. Then he pointed toward a nearby bench beside the sidewalk. "Sit with me for a minute," he said calmly. Ethan hesitated at first, but something inside him told him to stay. The two sat down under the dim orange glow of a streetlight while the city slowly began waking up around them. The old man took a small notebook from his hoodie pocket and placed it on the bench between them. "What time did you wake up yesterday?" he asked. Ethan looked embarrassed. "Almost noon." "And today?" Ethan looked away. "Same thing." The old man nodded slowly. "Then your problem is not motivation. Your problem is identity." Ethan frowned in confusion. "What does that even mean?" The old man leaned back slightly and looked toward the dark skyline. "Every day you repeat the same habits," he explained. Sleep late. Wake up tired. Waste your mornings. Ignore your goals. Little by little, your habits become proof of the person you believe you are. Ethan stayed silent. Deep down, he knew the man was right. The old man continued speaking in the same calm voice. Most people wait for a big moment to change their lives. But real change almost never arrives loudly. It begins quietly, usually before sunrise, when nobody is watching. Ethan listened carefully while cold air filled his lungs. For the first time in a long time, he felt fully awake. The old man opened the notebook and tore out a small piece of paper. Then he wrote 3 simple lines. 20 minutes move. 20 minutes reflect. 20 minutes learn. He handed the paper to Ethan. Do this every morning for 30 days, he said. Before your phone. Before social media. Before excuses. Ethan stared at the paper. That is it, he asked. That sounds too simple. The old man smiled again. Simple does not mean easy. Then he pointed toward Ethan's chest. Right now your mind is full of noise. Fear. Doubt. Comparison. You wake up every day reacting to life instead of leading it. But when you control the first hour of your morning, you slowly begin controlling yourself. Ethan folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Part of him still doubted everything he was hearing. But another part of him, a part he had ignored for years, wanted to believe this could work. The sky above the city slowly shifted from black to dark blue as the first signs of sunrise appeared behind the buildings. The old man stood up and adjusted his hoodie. One more thing, he said before walking away. Ethan looked up. The hardest part is not waking up at 5 in the morning, the old man said quietly. The hardest part is becoming the kind of person who no longer wants to escape his own life. Then he turned and disappeared down the empty street, while Ethan remained sitting alone on the bench, staring at the small piece of paper in his hand as the first sunlight touched the city. That morning, Ethan did not go home immediately. He stayed on the bench long after the old man disappeared into the quiet streets. The small piece of paper remained in his hand while the city slowly came alive around him. Cars began filling the roads. Coffee shops turned on their lights. People in business suits walked quickly toward train stations with focused expressions on their faces. For the first time, Ethan noticed something strange. The people awake this early moved differently. They looked purposeful, calm, like they already knew where they were going while the rest of the world was still asleep. Ethan looked down at the paper again. 20 minutes move. 20 minutes reflect. 20 minutes learn. 3 simple sentences. Yet somehow they felt heavier than all the advice videos he had watched over the years. By the time Ethan returned to his apartment, sunlight was pouring through the windows. Normally, he would crawl into bed and sleep for half the day. But this time he stood in the middle of his messy room without moving. Dirty dishes filled the sink. Empty soda cans covered the desk. His phone buzzed nonstop with notifications, but he ignored it. He slowly walked toward the bathroom mirror and stared at himself. Pale skin, heavy eyes, messy hair, exhaustion. Ethan barely recognized the person looking back at him. Then he remembered the old man's words. Your habits become proof of the person you believe you are. Ethan lowered his eyes quietly. For years he had called himself lazy, unlucky, and unmotivated. At first those words felt temporary. But over time, he started living like they were true. He stopped trusting himself. He stopped keeping promises to himself. Even small promises. Wake up early. Exercise tomorrow. Apply for jobs. Read 1 chapter. Drink more water. Every broken promise slowly taught his mind one dangerous lesson. You cannot trust yourself anymore. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed as that thought repeated inside his head. Outside, the city kept moving forward while he remained stuck in the same place. Suddenly, he reached into his pocket and unfolded the paper again. Then he grabbed a black marker from his desk and wrote something across the top. 30 days. He taped the paper directly onto the wall beside his bed, where he could see it the moment he opened his eyes. I will try, he whispered quietly. But deep inside, fear still remained. Ethan had tried changing before. Gym memberships, productivity apps, morning routines, motivational videos. None of them lasted. Every attempt ended the same way. A few good days followed by disappointment. That was the part nobody talked about. Starting was easy. Continuing was hard. Ethan looked at his phone screen and checked the time. 7:12 a.m. Normally, he would already be asleep again by now. Instead, he walked toward the kitchen sink and began washing the dishes one by one. The apartment stayed silent except for running water and the sound of plates clinking softly together. It was a small action, simple, almost meaningless. But while cleaning, Ethan noticed something strange happening inside him. For the first time in months, his mind felt slightly clearer, slightly lighter. That afternoon, exhaustion finally hit him, and Ethan collapsed onto his bed. But before falling asleep, he set his alarm for 5 a.m. Then he placed his phone on the opposite side of the room, where he would be forced to stand up to turn it off. As he closed his eyes, one thought quietly entered his mind. Maybe his life was not destroyed. Maybe it had simply been waiting for him to wake up. At exactly 5 o'clock the next morning, Ethan's alarm exploded through the darkness of his apartment like a fire alarm. His eyes opened halfway before immediately closing again. Every part of his body felt heavy. Warm blankets wrapped around him while cold air filled the room outside his bed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the alarm rang again. Ethan groaned quietly and pulled the blanket over his head. "Just 10 more minutes," he whispered to himself. But then his eyes landed on the small paper taped beside the wall. 30 days. Ethan stared at those words in silence while exhaustion battled inside his mind. One voice told him to sleep. Another voice quietly reminded him of the man on the street. Slowly, Ethan pushed himself out of bed and stumbled across the room to turn off the alarm. His apartment was completely silent. Outside the window, the sky was still dark blue. Chicago had not fully awakened yet. Ethan looked at the clock. 5:02 a.m. A strange feeling moved through him. He could not remember the last time he had seen the world this early. For a few seconds, he considered climbing back into bed. Nobody would know. Nobody would care. But deep down, Ethan understood something important. If he quit now, he would teach himself the same lesson again. You never finish what you start. He took a deep breath and forced himself toward the bathroom sink. Cold water hit his face, waking him slightly. Then he changed into an old gray sweatshirt and running shoes he had not worn in months. The first 20 minutes were supposed to be movement. Ethan decided to walk outside. The cold morning air hit him immediately as he stepped onto the sidewalk. Everything felt different at that hour. The streets were quiet. Store lights glowed softly through dark windows. A few people jogged past with headphones on while buses slowly moved through nearly empty roads. Ethan shoved his hands into his pockets and walked without any real direction. At first, his thoughts remained negative. This is pointless. You are going to quit in 3 days anyway. Nothing about your life will change. But after several minutes, something surprising happened. His breathing slowed down. His mind became quieter. The constant noise in his head softened slightly. By the time he returned to his apartment, 20 minutes had passed. Ethan checked the paper again. 20 minutes reflect. He sat at his kitchen table with an old notebook and stared at the empty page. At first, he felt stupid. What was he even supposed to write? After a long silence, he finally wrote one sentence. I am tired of disappointing myself. Ethan looked at the words for several seconds. Then more thoughts slowly began pouring onto the page. He wrote about his fear of failure, his lost confidence, his habit of escaping reality through social media and sleep. For the first time in years, he stopped hiding from himself. When the final 20 minutes arrived, Ethan searched online for a free audiobook about discipline and personal growth. He sat quietly by the window while the narrator spoke calmly about habits, focus, and identity. Outside, sunlight slowly began filling the city. Ethan looked at the clock again. 6:03 a.m. Most people around him were still asleep, but Ethan had already walked outside, reflected on his life, and learned something new before sunrise. It was not a dramatic transformation. He did not suddenly become successful, confident, or fearless. But something small had shifted inside him. For the first time in a very long time, Ethan felt proud of himself. And that feeling, though quiet and fragile, was enough to make him return the next morning. The second morning was harder than the first. Ethan woke up before the alarm even rang, but instead of feeling motivated, he felt exhausted. His body ached from the cold walk the day before, and his mind immediately searched for excuses. You already proved you can do it once. Missing one day will not matter. Ethan stared at the ceiling while those thoughts circled through his head. Then he noticed something strange. The excuses sounded automatic, almost like they had been waiting for him every morning. For years, he had listened to them without questioning anything. But now, for the first time, he paused and asked himself a simple question. What if those thoughts are the reason my life never changes? Slowly, he sat up again. Outside his window, the sky remained dark and silent. Ethan walked toward the kitchen and drank a glass of water before putting on his running shoes. This time, instead of walking aimlessly, he decided to jog slowly around the block. His breathing became heavy after only a few minutes. Cold air burned his lungs, while his legs felt weak and stiff. A younger version of Ethan would have stopped immediately, but another thought entered his mind. If your body is weak, train it. If your mind is weak, train it too. By the time he returned home, sweat covered his forehead despite the freezing temperature outside. Ethan looked in the bathroom mirror and noticed a small spark in his eyes that had not been there before. It was not confidence yet, but it was movement. During his reflection time that morning, Ethan wrote something new in his notebook. Discipline is keeping promises to yourself. He stared at the sentence quietly. That idea stayed with him throughout the day. Every time he ignored responsibilities in the past, every time he quit early, every time he chose comfort over growth, he had slowly broken trust with himself. And when a person stops trusting themselves, even simple goals begin to feel impossible. Later that afternoon, Ethan went to a nearby grocery store to buy healthier food for the week. While standing in line, he suddenly noticed how distracted everyone looked. Almost every person around him stared down at a glowing phone screen. Nobody seemed fully present. Nobody seemed calm. For a moment, Ethan thought about his own habits. Every morning before this week, the first thing he touched was his phone. News, notifications, social media, comparison, noise. Before his mind even had a chance to wake up, the world already controlled his attention. That evening, Ethan made another small decision. Before going to sleep, he placed his phone inside a kitchen drawer instead of beside his bed. The silence felt uncomfortable at first, almost frightening. Without videos or endless scrolling, his apartment suddenly felt too quiet. His own thoughts became louder. But instead of escaping them, Ethan opened his notebook again. He wrote down goals he had avoided for years. Find meaningful work. Get healthy. Become dependable. Stop wasting life. The words looked simple on paper, yet they carried emotional weight inside him. Before sleeping, Ethan checked the calendar on his wall. Only 2 days had passed. 2 small mornings. 2 simple routines. Yet something inside him already felt different. Not because his life had magically improved overnight, but because for the first time in years, he was no longer drifting through his days unconsciously. He was beginning to notice his habits, his thoughts, and the choices shaping his future. As Ethan turned off the lights and lay in bed, he remembered another sentence the old man had spoken. Real change begins quietly. Ethan finally understood what that meant. Most transformations do not begin with huge success or dramatic moments. They begin in silence, in darkness, in small decisions nobody else can see. By the end of the first week, Ethan realized something important. Waking up early was not the real challenge. The real challenge was facing himself every morning before the world became loud. Some mornings felt peaceful, but other mornings felt like a battle happening entirely inside his own mind. On the 7th day, Ethan woke up feeling angry for no clear reason. His body felt tired, his motivation disappeared, and dark clouds covered the city outside his apartment window. The warm bed behind him felt impossible to leave. For several minutes, he simply sat there staring at the floor. Then his eyes moved toward the notebook on his desk. He remembered something he had written days earlier. Discipline is keeping promises to yourself. Ethan slowly stood up again, not because he felt inspired, not because he suddenly became strong. He stood up because he was tired of becoming the kind of person who always quit when things became uncomfortable. That morning, instead of jogging, Ethan decided to walk to a small park a few blocks away. The grass was wet from overnight rain, and cold wind moved through the empty trees. A few runners passed him quietly while the city slowly woke in the distance. Ethan sat alone on a wooden bench and watched the sunrise push through the gray clouds. The world looked calm at that hour. Simple. Peaceful. He suddenly realized how chaotic his old mornings used to be. Waking up late, rushing, checking notifications immediately, feeling behind before the day even started. For years, his mornings had trained his mind to live in reaction instead of intention. But now these quiet hours before sunrise were slowly teaching him something different. Patience, awareness, control. During his reflection time later that morning, Ethan opened his notebook and wrote a question across the page. Why do I always run away from discomfort? He stared at the sentence for a long time. Then memories slowly surfaced in his mind. Every difficult conversation he avoided. Every opportunity he delayed. Every healthy habit he abandoned because it became boring or difficult. Ethan finally understood a painful truth. His problem was never lack of potential. His problem was emotional escape. Whenever life became uncomfortable, he distracted himself. Sleep, social media, junk food, endless entertainment. Temporary comfort had quietly stolen years from his life. That realization stayed with him all day. Later that afternoon, Ethan visited a coffee shop to apply for jobs online. While sitting near the window, he noticed a businessman working quietly at another table. The man looked focused and calm, completely locked into his work while ignoring the noise around him. Ethan watched him for several seconds before realizing something surprising. Discipline was visible. You could see it in the way people carried themselves. Focused people moved differently. They spoke differently. They respected their own time. Ethan looked down at his phone lying beside his coffee cup. For the first time, he did not feel controlled by it. Instead of opening social media, he opened his notebook again and wrote another sentence. Small habits shape identity. That night, Ethan returned home feeling mentally exhausted but strangely proud. His life still looked ordinary from the outside. He was not rich. He did not suddenly become successful. His apartment was still small. His future was still uncertain. But internally, something important was happening. Ethan was no longer waiting for motivation to save him. He was slowly building trust with himself one morning at a time. And although nobody else could see the change yet, Ethan could feel it quietly growing inside him like the first light before sunrise. 2 weeks passed, and something unexpected began happening to Ethan. The outside of his life still looked ordinary, but the inside of his mind no longer felt the same. Every morning at 5 o'clock, while the city remained quiet and dark, Ethan continued following the routine written on the small paper beside his bed. Move, reflect, learn. At first, the actions felt forced, but now they were slowly becoming part of who he was. One morning, Ethan noticed he no longer needed 3 alarms to wake up. His eyes opened naturally a few minutes before 5. Instead of reaching for his phone, he immediately sat up and put on his running shoes. That small moment shocked him. For years, mornings had felt like punishment. Now they felt like a private opportunity. The streets outside had started becoming familiar to him. The quiet coffee shop opening before sunrise. The old woman walking her dog every morning at the same corner. The joggers crossing the bridge while the first sunlight touched the skyline. Ethan realized something important. While most people slept, an entirely different world existed in those early hours. A calmer world. A focused world. A world where people worked on themselves before distractions arrived. During his morning walks, Ethan began listening to audiobooks about discipline, focus, and mindset. One sentence stayed in his mind for days. Your future is hidden inside your daily routine. At first, Ethan thought success came from huge decisions or lucky opportunities. But now he understood that most lives are shaped quietly by repeated habits nobody notices. Little by little, Ethan started making other changes without forcing himself. He drank more water. He cleaned his apartment regularly. He stopped scrolling endlessly late at night. Instead of sleeping until noon on weekends, he woke up early and visited bookstores or parks around the city. These were not dramatic transformations, but they created something he had not felt in years. Momentum. One afternoon, Ethan received a text message from an old friend named Marcus. They had not spoken in months. Marcus asked if Ethan wanted to grab coffee downtown. When Ethan arrived at the cafe, Marcus looked surprised the moment he saw him. You look different, he said immediately. Ethan laughed awkwardly. Different how? Marcus shrugged. I do not know. More awake, I guess. More focused. Ethan stayed quiet for a moment after hearing those words. Nobody had ever described him that way before. Throughout the conversation, Ethan noticed something else too. For the first time in years, he was fully present. He was listening carefully instead of checking his phone every few minutes. His mind felt calmer, slower, clearer. Later that evening, Ethan returned home and stood in front of the bathroom mirror again. The same mirror he had looked into weeks earlier when he barely recognized himself. But now his eyes looked different. Not perfect, not fearless, but alive. Ethan suddenly understood something the old man had tried to teach him from the beginning. Discipline was never really about waking up early. It was about becoming someone you could respect. Every small habit was shaping his identity quietly in the background. Every early morning was teaching his mind a new lesson. You are capable of change. You can trust yourself again. That night, Ethan opened his notebook and flipped back to the very first page where he had written, "I am tired of disappointing myself." He stared at the sentence for a long moment before smiling quietly. Then he picked up his pen and wrote something new underneath it. "I think I am finally becoming the person I was supposed to be." By the fourth week, Ethan no longer recognized the life he used to live. Not because everything around him had changed, but because he had changed. The mornings that once felt impossible had become normal. Every day before sunrise, he woke up without negotiation. No endless snooze button. No lying in bed scrolling through distractions. He simply stood up and moved. And with every morning he conquered, his confidence grew quietly stronger. One freezing Saturday morning, Ethan jogged along the Chicago River while orange sunlight reflected across the water. His breathing was steady now. His body felt lighter, stronger. As he passed glass buildings glowing in the early morning light, he realized something strange. The city looked different than it used to. Or maybe he was the one seeing differently. Now, weeks earlier, Ethan viewed the world through exhaustion and self-doubt. Every successful person seemed intimidating. Every challenge felt overwhelming. But discipline had slowly changed the way his mind interpreted life itself. Problems no longer looked permanent. They looked manageable. Later that day, Ethan received an email inviting him to interview for a marketing position at a small creative agency downtown. Normally, opportunities like this would fill him with anxiety. He would overthink everything, procrastinate preparing, and doubt himself before even showing up. But this time felt different. Over the past month, Ethan had already been proving something to himself every single morning. You can do difficult things. That simple belief changed the way he walked into the interview room 3 days later. Calm posture, clear eyes, focused energy. During the interview, the hiring manager paused halfway through the conversation and smiled. "You seem very disciplined for someone your age," she said. Ethan almost laughed when he heard those words. If she had met him 2 months earlier, she would have seen a completely different person. But that was the strange thing about habits. Small actions repeated consistently begin changing the way the world sees you. Ethan got the job offer later that evening. As he stood alone in his apartment reading the email on his laptop screen, he felt proud, but not for the reason he expected. The job itself was not the biggest victory. The biggest victory was the person he had become while preparing for it. Ethan slowly walked toward the bathroom mirror again. The same mirror that once reflected exhaustion, confusion, and disappointment. Now he saw someone calmer, someone more grounded, someone who no longer needed motivation every day to move forward. He finally understood the deeper truth behind everything the old man had taught him. Success was never created in one dramatic moment. It was built quietly through ordinary mornings nobody else could see. Every early wake up, every difficult walk outside, every moment he resisted old habits, every page written in his notebook. Those tiny actions had slowly rebuilt his identity from the inside out. That night, Ethan sat beside his window watching the city lights flicker beneath the dark sky. People rushed through the streets below while glowing phone screens illuminated crowded trains and sidewalks. Ethan thought about how many people were waiting for their lives to change while ignoring the small habits shaping them every day. He opened his notebook one final time before bed and wrote a sentence across a fresh page. "Discipline did not change my schedule. It changed who I believed I was." Ethan placed the notebook beside his bed and turned off the lights. A few seconds later, he smiled quietly in the darkness after realizing something that would have sounded impossible weeks earlier. He was actually excited to wake up tomorrow morning. 6 months later, Ethan stood alone on the rooftop of his apartment building just before sunrise. Cold morning air moved gently through the city while thousands of lights still glowed beneath the dark blue sky. In the distance, trains rolled through downtown Chicago, and somewhere below, people hurried through another sleepless night. Ethan wrapped his hands around a warm cup of coffee and looked out over the skyline in silence. This had become his favorite part of the day, the quiet before the noise, the moment before the world demanded his attention. Months earlier, Ethan used to wake up feeling lost before his feet even touched the floor. Every morning began with stress, distraction, and regret. But now, the mornings felt different. They felt like a reset. A private conversation between who he used to be and who he was becoming. His life was not perfect. He still had difficult days. He still felt fear sometimes. There were mornings when motivation disappeared completely. But the difference now was simple. Ethan no longer depended on motivation to move forward. He trusted his habits. That trust changed everything. The marketing agency job had given him stability, but something even more valuable had happened over the past several months. Ethan started respecting himself again. He showed up on time. He followed through on commitments. He exercised consistently. He spent less time escaping through distractions and more time building a meaningful future. Even his apartment looked different now. Cleaner, brighter, organized. Ethan realized environments quietly reflect the condition of the mind living inside them. One Saturday morning, while jogging near the river before sunrise, Ethan suddenly noticed a familiar figure sitting alone on a bench. Gray hair, black hoodie, calm posture. The old man. Ethan stopped immediately, almost shocked to see him again after all those months. The old man smiled as Ethan approached. "You look awake now," he said softly. Ethan laughed quietly before sitting beside him. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. They simply watched the sunrise slowly spread across the city skyline. Finally, Ethan looked down at his hands and shook his head in disbelief. "You were right," he admitted. "My life changed." The old man smiled gently. "No," he replied. "Your habits changed first. Then your life followed." Ethan sat silently as those words settled deep inside him. The old man pointed toward the horizon where sunlight slowly touched the tops of buildings across the city. "Every morning," he said calmly, "life asks people one question. Will you lead your mind, or will your mind lead you?" Ethan looked out across the waking city while memories flashed through his head. The missed opportunities, the late mornings, the exhaustion, the empty apartment, the hopeless version of himself who believed change was impossible. And then he thought about the person sitting there now. Calm, focused, present, not because of luck, not because life suddenly became easy, but because small decisions repeated daily had slowly transformed his identity. The old man stood up slowly and adjusted his hoodie. "Most people wait for motivation," he said before turning away. "But the people who change their lives learn something different. Discipline arrives first. Confidence comes later." Then he walked away into the quiet morning crowd, while Ethan remained sitting alone on the bench. The city around him continued waking up as sunlight filled the streets one building at a time. Ethan took a slow breath and closed his eyes for a moment. Somewhere nearby, another alarm clock was ringing inside another apartment. Another tired person was deciding whether to wake up or hit snooze again. Ethan opened his eyes and smiled quietly toward the sunrise because he finally understood something most people never realize until it is too late. A better life does not usually begin with one huge opportunity. It begins with one small morning decision repeated long enough to change who you are.